With all the turmoil about NATO's future, it's important that we have a conversation about the role of Ukraine in European security, because in many ways, Ukraine will be key if European NATO countries want to continue deterring Russia from aggression if the United States withdraws from the alliance. So let's talk about it. In discussions about the war in Ukraine and what European security will look like on the other side of this war, there is sometimes a tendency in the West to see Ukraine as a burden. Ukraine is described as someone who needs our assistance during the war, and then after the war, they will need our security guarantees so they can stay safe and prevent another Russian attack. In that view, Ukraine is seen as someone who consumes resources from Western Europe rather than someone who is giving something back. This perspective is problematic because it overlooks how important Ukraine actually is for European security, and it also gives a misleading impression of the military strength of the different countries in Europe. It suggests that Western Europe is stronger than Ukraine in military terms, and that's actually not true. So what I want to do in this video is to go through why Ukraine is so important for European security, and I'm going to focus on two aspects. First, there's the question of military strength, and then after that, the question of geography. So to begin with the question of military strength, there are many people who have a misconception about why the Russians are struggling to make progress on the front line in eastern Ukraine. They think it's because Russia is weak, and therefore they see the stalemate as evidence that Russia is not as strong an enemy as it is sometimes described. That perception is wrong. The reason Russia is struggling to make progress on the front line is not that Russia is weak, but that Ukraine is very strong. Russia has the biggest army in Europe, but Ukraine has the second biggest. So what's happening in eastern Ukraine is that there is a war between the two largest armies in Europe. So it's very important that we in Western Europe don't fool ourselves into thinking that we have stronger armies that would be able to perform better than what the Ukrainians are doing, because that's not true at all. The Ukrainian army is much bigger than the German army, the French army, the British army. It's a huge army. And in addition to that, it's also combat proven. They have expertise, they have doctrine for modern drone warfare to a level that we simply do not. So in a time when the United States is withdrawing from European security and Europe is losing the strongest military power in the NATO alliance, it's almost self-evident that we need to start looking around in our neighborhood to see what other great military powers there are that we could potentially ally with. And here, Ukraine is an obvious choice. When the threat is the largest army in Europe, we simply have to have the second largest army on our side. So that's the aspect of military strength. Ukraine is simply a huge military power, and that's exactly who we need to be allied with right now. The second aspect is about geography. Ukraine is obviously located next to Russia, and it has a long land border with Russia, so being allied with Ukraine pushes the front line quite a bit eastward, which is good. But if we want to fully understand why Ukraine's geography is so important, we actually have to start with the geography of Belarus and the role that Belarus would play in a war about the Baltic states. When we talk about the potential for a war between NATO and Russia, it's often the Baltic scenario that comes up, meaning a Russian attack on Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. But if we look at the map, the land border between the Baltic states and Russia is not actually very long. The land border with Belarus is much longer. So a Russian attack on the Baltic states would almost inevitably have to go through Belarus. This particularly includes fighting in the so-called Suwalki Gap between Belarus and Kaliningrad. This is often seen as the place where Russian forces would try to cut off the Baltic states from receiving reinforcements from other NATO countries by severing the land border between Poland and Lithuania. And in the age of maritime drones that we live in, it might be very difficult to use maritime transportation across the Baltic Sea, so the Suwalki Gap is extremely important for the defense of the Baltic states. So from a NATO perspective, the last thing we want is for the Russians and the Belarusians to be allowed to focus their forces on the western and northwestern borders of Belarus. What we want is to make sure that they have to spread out their forces because they will be facing threats from many directions. And this way, they will have as few forces as possible available for the attack on the Baltic states and the Suwalki corridor. And this is where Ukraine comes into the picture because Ukraine covers the entire southern border of Belarus. In fact, if you count Ukraine as part of the Western alliance, Belarus is almost surrounded by Western forces. The only safe border they have is the border to Russia in the east. So if we want to pull Russian and Belarusian forces away from a front line between Belarus and the Baltic states, then Ukraine has the almost perfect location to achieve that. In fact, if we look at this through the eyes of a Russian military planner who is preparing an attack on the Baltic states, then they would probably view the NATO forces in the area as something that they might be able to handle because we don't have much of a forward presence, and they would probably be able to mobilize a large force in that area faster than we could. However, the presence of Europe's second largest army standing right there on the southern border of Belarus, being allied with the people you're trying to attack, would really complicate their planning, and it could potentially be a deal breaker. So Ukraine is vital for the ability of the European NATO states to deter Russia from aggression and potentially win the war. And I think it's important that we elevate the discussion from being a question about how we, with a coalition of the willing, can provide security guarantees to Ukraine and into more of a discussion about how we can build a real mutual defense alliance with Ukraine. Ukraine is never going to be a member of NATO because that would require unanimity, and there is no unanimity for that. So that's not going to happen, but we need to build something else that covers more or less the same. We can copy the same treaty, we can give it a different name, and we can say this is the new European Defense Alliance, but we need to have a discussion about how Ukraine can support us and not just how we can support them. The security goes both ways, and we might deploy forces to Ukraine as part of security guarantees so Russia won't attack Ukraine again. But Ukraine will also be deploying troops to, for example, the Baltic states. So we could have, for example, a Ukrainian division in Lithuania. But the point is that for our sake and our security, we need to formalize this alliance with Ukraine in a time when the Americans are abandoning Europe and becoming unreliable as a security guarantee. Ukraine is an absolutely necessary partner. And that actually leads to a third point that's also worth considering that speaks in Ukraine's favor. In addition to having a huge army and important military geography, there is also the determination to fight against Russia. You will not find anyone in the entire world that has greater determination to stand up to Russian aggression than the Ukrainians. And that's important because it means that Ukraine will be reliable. We can trust that they will actually be ready to fight the Russians if need be. And that political determination, unfortunately, is not something that we can take for granted with all the other countries in NATO right now. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video helpful or informative, then please give it a like. And if you want to get access to bonus videos and support the channel, you can subscribe to my newsletter on www.logicalwar.com. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.